So tonight's program, as I indicated, is from the Illinois Humanities Rhodes Scholars Speakers Bureau. The mission of the Illinois Humanities is to strengthen the social, political, and economic fabric of Illinois through constructive conversation and civic engagement. And our Rhodes Scholars Speakers Bureau supports their mission by inviting Illinois authors, artists, and scholars to share their expertise and enthusiasm with people and communities throughout our state. So to learn about other Rhodes Scholar presentations, grant opportunities, you can visit illinoishumanities.org. And we hope you enjoyed tonight's Marshall Fields and Chicago. Our presenter today is Sarah Sullivan. She's a full-time history instructor at McHenry County College, where she's taught history and business classes over 20 years. She holds advanced degrees in American history, management, and human resources management. Her special areas of focus include women's history, the American Revolutionary period, and 19th century political and social history. Sarah enjoys making history accessible, interesting, and relevant to everyone, and loves sharing a good history story, which she will tonight with Marshall Fields and Chicago. Sarah, it's yours.
Well, thank you all very much for being here today virtually. It's an interesting world that we live in. I can't quite imagine what people would have said 100 years ago had they heard how we were going to conduct our business nowadays with this computer thing. So today I plan to share with you information about Marshall Fields and the early days of the business, as well as some connections between Marshall Fields and the history of Chicago. So let's go ahead and get started with the very earliest days. Field and Leiter is what the store was named before Marshall Field, the man, bought out Levi Leiter, his partner. So this was not the first retail business that Marshall Field was a partner in. The mid-19th century is very complicated with businesses. They tended to crop up and fold within short periods of time, and it's hard to nail all that down. So just know that Marshall Field was involved in several other businesses before he finally came to this one with Levi Leiter. This particular business was established on the roots of Potter Palmer's dry goods store. You probably know the name Potter Palmer from the Palmer House Hilton. Potter Palmer got his start with retail in his dry goods store, and eventually he married his much younger wife Bertha, and decided that he needed to refocus his life and focus just on real estate and making his wife happy. So he ended up selling his business, and Field and Leiter ended up purchasing it. So initially the store had, as you can see, a 32% return. And my goodness, any business that can show a 32% return is a pretty exciting business. As you'll see from this slide, by 1867, the retail side of the business is dramatically smaller than the wholesale side of the business. And this is pretty normal for the period. People just didn't go out and shop in the ways that we did even 20, 30 years ago. First of all, it was not very pleasant out there. It was dirty. There were cows, pigs, horses, dogs, chickens, ducks, and all sorts of things running around the streets. Also, you had men with chewing tobacco. The sides of the street would have probably been mud. Sometimes they were wooden, but women wearing long dresses would have rarely gone out on their own. And when they did go out, usually they had to bring a man with them. So shopping was not a social event in 1867 in that period. So again, wholesale is where it was at. By 1872, you can start to see the shift. Certainly wholesale is dramatically bigger, but you see retail is starting to grow. And the fact that it's growing, that kind of just foreshadows what's about to happen in the future. This particular slide has this image that I absolutely love. The image shows you corsets. And if you can look in the center of that ad, you'll notice that corsets, they sell corsets that fit all ages, infants to adults. And today when we think about corsets, we certainly don't think about young children wearing them. But if you want to have an 18, 19-inch waist as a grown-up, you have to start young. So corsets would have been worn from a very early age. And in the mid 19th century, men wore corsets as well. They weren't just for women. Everyone wore corsets because they provided support, and people thought that they were healthy. So I find that's always an interesting thing to point out. Field and Lighter focused on economies of scale in their business. So what they did is they sold, because they were selling wholesale and retail, they managed to keep their prices down since they had so much volume. In addition to that, they sold their domestic products at a loss, and they were able to make a lot more money on their foreign goods because they had access to foreign goods that many of the other retailers in the Chicago area didn't have. So these things helped Field and Lighter become a dominant business in the Chicago area. So by 1890, Marshall Fields had what we call a comprehensive product mix. They were selling lower priced goods to people of less means, as well as very high-end merchandise to people that had money. So everyone could find something at Marshall Fields to buy. Shopping by 1890 was now a social event. And we just start to see ready-to-wear clothing show up in stores. So before this period, if you wanted to buy a dress, you had to buy the fabric, you had to buy the thread, and if you're like me, you had to also pay a seamstress to sew it all together. By this period, we're starting to see the ability to buy clothes off the rack, but not in the way that we buy them today. So you think about going to Kohl's and trying things on and bringing them home, expecting them to fit you reasonably well. That's definitely not the case. Back then, it would have been expected that there would be some alterations on almost any item that was purchased. The other thing that I love about this particular picture is you can see there's very little merchandise on the showroom floor. So you think about this versus Kohl's or Macy's today. There's a lot of product jammed on the sales floor. Back here, you can see in this picture, not so much. So the way clothing used to be sold is a customer would come in and sit on one of the chairs, and you can see the chairs spread throughout the sales area. They would come in and sit down, and as they selected merchandise that they were interested in perhaps buying, there would be a model who would come out wearing each item of clothing so the person could inspect the clothes and decide if that was something they wanted to buy. So if you were a lady of means, you certainly did not get yourself all sweaty and sullied by putting clothes on and taking them off. What that meant is there was a lot more storage in the back and a lot less sales floor than what we're used to today. That obviously eventually shifted, but that is the way people bought their clothes in the earliest period. By 1890, women started to come to the store almost every day. The store was, to use a business term, sticky. And what we mean by that is like your bank today. It's difficult to quit your bank even if you're angry with them, because you've got direct deposits and you've got bill pays and all those sorts of things. It makes it difficult to just quit. Well, Marshall Fields, not necessarily in a negative way, but in a positive way, made their store very sticky. There were a lot of activities that women particularly could engage in on a daily basis. They had fashion shows, they had cooking lessons, all sorts of things to allow people to stay there almost all day. The other thing that they had that was very important is they had restrooms. So in the 1890s, early 20th century, if you were a woman and you left your house, you really didn't have very many places that you could use the bathroom. So I don't know about you, but I have maybe a 3 or 4 hour window before I might be looking for a bathroom. And that would mean if there wasn't one available, that might be the end of my shopping day. Marshall Fields had bathrooms, public bathrooms that people could use. So that was a game changer. The other thing that they had was restaurants, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment. Marshall Fields was a place to see and be seen. I love this image and imagining women peering over from the balconies, making sure that they see everyone who's in the store and that they are noticed as well. These balconies are very important for another reason. Marshall Fields came to be during a period when there wasn't electric lighting like we're used to today. So the store would have been lit by gas, which was not very efficient. The other way the store would have been lit is through natural light. So if you look at the outside of the State Street store, you'll see that the building was not built all at the same time. There's different heights of the roof in different areas. And you'll also see that there are some open spaces. There are some like fire escapes that seem to just disappear into nowhere. So the building was designed with a lot of skylights and little atriums and things to allow light to come through. And you can see this even in the design of the main part of the store. This design would have allowed a lot of light to come in to help people make their purchases. So of course, when people can't see things, they can't buy them. The ceiling at Marshall Fields on the Washington Street entrance is a Tiffany mosaic. It is the largest Tiffany mosaic that has ever been made. And it is incredibly gorgeous. So I strongly encourage you, if you get a chance and you haven't done it already, go down to the State Street store and go in the Washington entrance and look up at that ceiling. It is amazing. I've tried to take pictures and it is hard to capture just how gorgeous the ceiling is. Now that the store is Macy's, it's not that crowded. You can lay on the floor, look up at the ceiling and just be awestruck. So right near the perfume area, you really can't miss it. Here's another close-up of the mosaic. So again, you can see the level of detail involved in this. It's just incredible. And here's another image from that ceiling. So beyond the bathrooms and the sales floor, Marshall Field had several other things that made it a sticky place that people wanted to be at all day. One of the things that they had were very elaborate women's and men's lounges. So these lounges were places that people could go and literally just manage their social affairs. So you could go to Marshall Fields to plan your wedding, for example. And how smart was that for Marshall Fields to have women planning their weddings right there in the store? As people realized what they need, Marshall Fields is right there to help take care of it. So women would come in during their shopping time if they needed to take a break. They were tired, or if they just wanted to engage socially with other people. This would have been a very busy place, and this would have been a place that ladies who lunched, the leisure set, would have definitely stopped in every time they shopped. Again, this is a place to see and be seen. They had writing tables, they had reading materials, you could read magazines, they had stationery, all sorts of things to make sure that people were able to conduct business. It was almost like an office. They had 7 different restaurants at one time at the State Street store. This is an image from one of them. And here is another. We'll talk about the Walnut Room and the start for all the restaurants soon, but I do want to point out that Marshall Fields, again, they had 7 restaurants in their State Street store at one time. And let's think about that. Obviously in restaurants, you're not going to potentially make as much per square foot as you might in retail. And if the business of Marshall Fields was selling products, then obviously a restaurant really doesn't get you to that point. So why did they have so many restaurants in the store? It was, again, because it made the store sticky. It made people want to come and to stay a little longer. And the longer people stayed, the more likely they were to spend money. So they dedicated, like I said, quite a bit of their sales floor space to restaurants and these men's and women's lounges and other areas that didn't directly bring in revenue, but encourage people to stay. Here's another. And then give the lady what she wants is a phrase that is credited to Marshall Fields, the man. And through the presentation, I will try to make it distinct whether I'm talking about Marshall Fields the person or Marshall Fields the store. It gets a little confusing sometimes. So Marshall Fields the man is credited with saying, give the lady what she wants. Did he really say it? It's hard to say. This image of the book here, this is a book that was sent out to every Marshall Fields credit card customer for their 100-year anniversary. I do have a copy of this. If you have 1 penny plus shipping through Amazon, you could also get a copy of this, or at least that's how much I paid for it. So they are out there. It's a very, it's a pulp piece, it's propaganda, but certainly very interesting. It's the Marshall Fields perspective on what made Marshall Fields special. So The story of Give the Lady What She Wants, according to the Marshall Fields store, is that there was a salesperson dealing with a customer, and the salesperson was telling the customer that he couldn't help her with what she was asking to have. And Marshall Fields came up to the salesperson and said, give the lady what she wants. Whether that's true or not, that was the perspective of Marshall Fields. I worked there in the 1990s, the early 90s, and it surprised me when I first started there that we would have people that would come in with, I worked in men's sportswear, and there would be people who would come in with a shirt that maybe was 4 or 5 years old, but they had the receipt. As long as they had the receipt, we would return it for the money that they paid for it. And Marshall Fields accepted everything for returns, no matter what. That was unheard of in that period. People just did not return things. And knowing that the company would stand by the products made people more loyal to Fields and made people more likely to purchase. The other thing that they did is they pioneered customer service. They really focused on making sure that their customers would come back time and time again. This was a period of the snake oil salesman, and the goal of many businesses was to sell a product to you today. And Fields decided that was not how they were going to do business. Their goal was to get you to be a customer for life. So because they played the long game versus focusing on the short term, they ended up doing very well with their customers. They also didn't misrepresent the products. This was a time where, again, snake oil salesmen lying about products, telling you it's amazing, it will cure everything. Fields, the store, did not do that. They also didn't haggle over prices. And this is important because you start to see women going out and shopping on their own. Women were very uncomfortable with the idea of haggling over prices. And many times they felt like they had to bring a man with in order to shop. And because Marshall Fields did not haggle, they just set a price, and the price was the price. People felt much safer shopping there. So Marshall Fields really geared themselves to be appealing to women. They also did a lot of advertising in magazines and newspapers, helping women identify current styles. And of course, when you identify current styles for women, you're also helping them to realize that they need to purchase those styles. The period in which they're advertising is really only a couple of years after Godey's Ladies book is literally hand painting images in their magazines. You had women that was their job, was painting the dresses in magazines so people could see what they look like. So the fact that Marshall Fields is advertising in this way was revolutionary and very exciting for people, women. By 1914, Marshall Fields and Company was the largest department store in the world. The State Street store covered a block, and it was over 35 acres with 65 display windows. They had their own transit stop. And the reason why they got that is because Marshall Fields, the man, was a smart guy. He was on the board of the Chicago Transit Authority. And when it came time to decide where a transit stop would be on State Street, he suggested Marshall Fields. So lo and behold, Marshall Fields became a transit stop. So anyone that wanted to shop on State Street had to get off on the second floor of Marshall Fields and walk through the store. So how clever is that? Because of course, as you walk through the store, you might see things that you want to purchase. So it just encouraged more foot traffic through the store. By 1914, Marshall Fields offered long distance telephone services in a time when people having telephones in their homes was still a rarity. They offered a post office, a telegraph office, stenography, travel agency, concierge. And this is one of my favorite Marshall Fields stories, is that there's at least one man who did not want to have to interact directly with his ex-wife. So he would drop his alimony checks at Marshall Fields for her to pick up. And to me, that is great on multiple levels. It says a lot about the position that Marshall Fields held in the community. And I also get a chuckle imagining this ex-wife at Marshall Fields with this check. And I'm sure she spent a good chunk of the money right there at Marshall Fields, since she was there with money in her hand. I know when I worked there, I didn't make a penny because every time I got a paycheck, I signed it right over to Marshall Fields to pay for all the things that I purchased with my credit card in the past billing cycle. So Marshall Field and Company led the way. Marshall Field, the man, was an innovator when it comes to retailing. And Marshall Field's, the store, was among the first to do all of these things, to use lavish display windows. So prior to this, display windows served only one purpose, and that was to let light in. Most of the time, the windows were somewhat dirty, and the stuff in front of the windows is just stuff that happened to be put in front of the windows. So it occurred to Marshall Fields, the man, that this was space that could be used to encourage people to come in and buy products. The earliest mannequins used at Marshall Fields were actually wax. And if you think about Chicago on a sunny, hot day in the summer, you can imagine how quickly they moved away from wax to wooden mannequins. I'm sure that must have been terrifying for young children to see these people in the windows melting. They were among the first to offer a sales office in Europe, and that was very important because there was a time where getting the latest fashion from Paris and other European destinations was essential. So having a sales office right there in Europe allowed them to be among the first to bring product over to the United States. They were among the first to have a bridal registry. They were the first to open and coin the phrase bargain basement. This was a Gordon Selfridge initiative. Gordon Selfridge was, he was a partner at Marshall Fields for a period of time before he left. Gordon Selfridge was a bit of a peacock, and he wanted a little bit more out of the relationship with Marshall Fields, the store and the man, than what he was getting. So he ended up packing up and leaving and going to Europe. But he was the one that coined this phrase. And bargain basement turned out to be a really good innovation for Fields because it allowed them to clear out the old merchandise at a decent price. It allowed them to use the basement, which never would have been used in a retail store for any other purpose. So it was unused space that they were able to use. And it encouraged bargain hunters and lower income people to come and purchase. So it ended up becoming very popular. They were the first to have dining rooms, suburban branches, escalators. The 1934 World's Fair that was held in Chicago, people would go to Northerly Island and enjoy the fair, and then they would come and ride the escalators at Marshall Fields. They were one of the first to offer revolving credit for retail. Credit for wholesale customers was a normal thing for quite a long time, but they were among the first to realize that consumers could be given credit as well. And that is an incredibly successful way to drive more business. When people do not have to pay for the product with the money in their pocket right then and there, it encourages people to buy more. They were among the first to offer personal shopping. There's some great images of Marshall Fields personal shopping. I didn't include any in the presentation because really what it looks like is just a room full of women sitting at desks answering telephones. But they had a very active personal shopping service at the store for quite a long time. And there were people that would literally buy a whole season or a year's worth of clothing all at once. They would call the personal shopper, and the shopper would send them all the desired items, and they would spend at that time hundreds of dollars in order to do that. Same day delivery for in-store purchases. And this was a big deal because, again, I'm always more happy or more willing to buy more product if I don't have to carry it. So they were averaging about 95,000 packages being delivered a day. Those green trucks, I'm sure we all remember those green trucks coming to town delivering product. Also, they were among the first to realize that it would be better to have women selling lingerie and feminine needs to women. So sales clerks at one time were all men. And of course, if you're a woman buying unmentionables, it is always more comfortable to do that with a woman. So they were among the first to be able to adopt women in that position. They were also pioneers in book signings. And this is, they had illustrious authors like Shirley Temple, Amelia Earhart, Carl Sandburg, and this is one of my favorite stories too, Judy the Elephant. So as the story goes, Judy the Elephant wrote a book. Obviously, it wasn't Judy the Elephant who actually wrote the book, but the book was credited to the author, Judy the Elephant. So Marshall Fields wanted to sponsor a book signing with Judy. Now, of course, there was no real Judy, so they brought an elephant from Lincoln Park Zoo to the State Street store. The elephant was brought to the third floor, which is where the book sales area was located. So the elephant signed books all day long, didn't actually sign, but stamped all the books with the stamper, and things went very smoothly until it was time for the elephant to leave. The elephant did not want to go down in the freight elevator in which she came up. So what do you do with an elephant at the end of a day in Marshall Fields? Obviously, they did not want the elephant to spend the night. I'm sure the elephant didn't either. So what they ended up having to do is contact Pepper Construction to come in at night and build an emergency ramp to help get the elephant down the 2-3 flights of stairs in order to get her out of the building. Pepper Construction has a great, they've got their version of this story on their website. It's really cute how they present it. So they were successful in getting the elephant out of the store. This was the first and last time they had an elephant in the State Street store. I think they learned an important lesson. In this period in the 40s and 50s, Marshall Fields was actually the largest book retailer in Chicago and in the Midwest. So they did an enormous business selling books in this period. Marshall Fields' service was second to none. By the mid 20th century, they had this long list of services that you could have access to. A millinery, which we don't really need very much anymore, but at one time, silver jewelry, watch repair, optical work, photography. Remember when we got film developed? Stationery, draperies, china and lamp repair. They could make your picture frames for you, personal shopping, and the Walnut Room, which was at one time the largest restaurant in Chicago. 5,000 people a day went through there, and the one-day record was 13,155 people shopping or eating in the Walnut Room. So in one day, they managed to have over 13,000 people eat in that restaurant. Wow. Speaking of the Walnut Room, let me give you the story of how that came to be. This is the Marshall Fields version of the story, and it's a little, perhaps a little urban legend. It's hard to verify some of this information with sources outside of Marshall Fields and their company lore. But as the story goes, there was a saleswoman on the floor selling goods to a group of society ladies, and the ladies realized that they were hungry and they needed to leave because there was no restaurant at that time. So since there was no food to be had at Marshall Fields, they needed to go home. They couldn't even stay in the Chicago area because the only place that was available to eat was in a saloon. And saloons were no place for women, particularly ladies. They would never eat in a saloon. So as a result, they were forced to leave the store. So as they were packing up to go, the saleswoman said, no, please don't leave. I'll share my lunch with you. So being that she was in Marshall Fields, she was able to set a pretty table with linens and china and flatware and all of that good stuff. And she served to these ladies what she brought for lunch. And that was her grandmother's chicken pot pie. So the ladies enjoyed it so much that they asked if they could come back and do it again. Gordon Selfridge saw this happening and realized that there was a market for a restaurant inside of Marshall Fields. And he fought to convince Marshall Fields, the man, that the store needed to have a restaurant. Mrs. Herring's chicken pot pie has been on the menu ever since then. I can't tell you for sure if that story is true. It seems a little fishes and loaves to me, but that is the story of how the Walnut Room came to be. Every Christmas, there's a 45-foot high Christmas tree with thousands of lights that is displayed in the Walnut Room. In the earliest years of the Walnut Room, the Christmas tree was actually a real tree, and they hired a man to sit overnight to watch the tree to make sure that it did not end up being on fire. So that was a man's job, is just to sit there at night and make sure that the tree did not end up burning, because real trees can be very flammable. And Marshall Fields had several issues with fires in the past. They've moved obviously to an artificial tree, and that has resolved the problem. Frango mints are obviously a Marshall Fields staple. There is kind of an urban legend that Frango mints used to be called Franco mints, and that was changed because of the Spanish Revolution. And that does not appear to be true. Marshall Fields at one time ended up buying other retail establishments in other large cities, including in Texas and on the West Coast. And one of the stores that they purchased on the West Coast sold Franco mints. And the Fields company was so impressed with this that they decided to produce them and sell them out of the Chicago location as well. So that's how the mints came to be. Moving on, the 28 shop. So by 1941, Marshall Fields was one of the first stores to offer an in-store boutique. And this was a really big deal because they sold couture designs, and there was a lot of cachet in doing that. So this particular store could only be accessed through a private elevator entrance, which was at 28 East Washington, hence the name 28 Shop. The name also signified the number of dressing rooms. They had 28 private dressing rooms. There were 14 different designs, and each had a twin. These dressing rooms were designed by the set designer from the Gone with the Wind. So you can imagine just how beautiful and sumptuous these dressing rooms would have been. The images that you see here in this photo, or in these two photos, they show you women shopping. And again, you notice none of them are trying anything on. They're not getting sweaty, struggling to pull things on and take things off. You see salespeople bringing goods out to these women who are sitting comfortably and looking. And that was still the norm, particularly with couture by the 1940s. You also see in the top image, the woman in the maid's uniform pouring tea or coffee or whatever she's pouring. And that would have been part of the service in that, in the 28 shop. So by the early 20th century, it became fairly obvious that there was a problem in the store. John G. Shedd, the second president of Marshall Fields, after Marshall Fields died, he noticed that there were too many men in the State Street store. And the men were making things uncomfortable. They were smoking their cigars, they were chewing tobacco and spitting it out. It wasn't good. So he decided what needed to be done is a men's annex. So an annex was built across the street from the State Street store, and that was where men's products were sold. They had a men's grill, which, as you can see, is a fairly manly sort of place. And they sold all sorts of products for men, including camping gear and clothing and sporting goods and all of that across the street. And that was a way to, again, kind of have more floor space for women in the State Street store and get the men out of that space. There were underground tunnels between the two stores, so products could be moved very easily from one to the other, just underground. Working at Marshall Fields was an interesting sort of situation. By 1906, the year that Marshall Fields, the man, passed away, there were over 12,000 permanent employees at the State Street store. If you worked at Marshall Fields, you could not eat, use tobacco, or gossip. I would love to know how Marshall Fields, the man, prevented people from gossiping. I've never worked at a business that was able to stop gossip, but apparently that was the rule. They offered employment for women at a time when employment was scarce. Women still were not often secretaries, and the teachers, they were certainly paid a lot less than men. That was still not a standard job for them. Women as nursing or as nurses was just starting to happen. So there weren't a lot of places where women could get jobs, and Fields was one of those places. Marshall Fields, the store, did not pay as well as some of the other retail establishments, but it was Marshall Fields, and that had cachet. Even when I worked there in the 1990s, I was always surprised by how often people would say, "Oh, you work at Marshall Fields," and that was almost 100 years after the period we're talking about. So the store had, at various times, they had a branch library of the Chicago Public Library. They had their own chorus that would go out and perform. They had employee dining rooms, and I don't mean a cafeteria, but a dining room. They also had individual lockers for each employee. They had cloakrooms, restrooms, lunchrooms. They had their own paper. They also gave vacation time. And this surprised me because I never really thought of businesses like Marshall Field as being very generous with time off. But Fields gave 2 weeks of vacation time after a year's service. And after 6 months, you got at least one, or you got at least 1 week off. So that was pretty revolutionary. In addition to that, you could arrange for sick time and some holidays. Now, this was a little tricky because Marshall Field's the man. He liked to be generous, but only when you didn't ask him to be. So if you came up to him and asked for something, he would be rather stingy with you. But if he saw that you were struggling, he would go out of his way to try to help. So he was very generous with sick time for people who he felt needed it, who certainly didn't end up asking for it. There was a men's gym and a women's recreation room because, of course, women did not exercise at this time. They had a company hospital. And when we say hospital, this is not necessarily a place where you go for, an open heart surgery or something. But if you think of more like an immediate care, they had a facility like that. They educated their cash boys. And a cash boy was somebody that would have been used in the very earliest days of the store. When the people on the sales floor needed change, they would yell for a cash boy who would come running and grab whatever change needed to be made, make the change and bring it back. So I like to think of them like the ball boys at Wimbledon, run up, grab the ball and run back. Eventually they were replaced by the pneumatic tubes that we still see if we go to the bank. I know we don't do that very often, but if you go to the bank to make a deposit, those tubes that kind of that shoot up with your check in them and then come back. When I was a kid, they always had a sucker in them. I don't think they do that anymore. But the cash boys, Marshall Field felt it was very important to give those boys education. In this period, many of them would not have been educated at all. They might have been working as young as 6 or 7. And he made it a priority to make sure that they were educated so they had more choices in their lives. Finally, he arranged for all of his employees to have access to savings accounts at a time when not everybody would have had access. And he made sure no matter how much money they had to deposit, that they were able to get those savings accounts. He was on the board of the bank, which certainly didn't help. And he made sure that they got 6% return on their money. I would really like to have that today. So let's talk a little bit about events in Chicago and how they connect to Marshall Field. The first one I want to talk about is the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. So Fields had a warehouse fire in 1870. They were coming right off of that in 1871 with the Great Chicago Fire. As you may know, that fire killed over 300 people, displaced 90,000 people, and destroyed about 18,000 buildings worth about $200 million. That fire did do some good for Chicago. First of all, it flattened much of the city, which allowed skyscrapers to be built in place of some of the buildings that were already there. It also extended the lakefront because they took all of the debris and they put it in the lake, and it ended up creating a lot of Grant Park. So there was good to happen in that fire as well. Marshall Fields, the store, was able to save about $200,000 in goods. The way that they did that is Marshall Field and Levi Leiter, who's still part of the store at this point, they and some of their other executives came to the store and they evacuated as many of the goods as they could. So what they did is they threw the merchandise that they could out windows and brought it down the stairs and all that, loaded it on wagons and sent it to the rail yard to be shipped to Joliet where it was safe. They managed to save about $200,000 in goods, but they ended up losing quite a bit. They lost about $300,000 all told with product that was not insured. That never happened again. They definitely changed their business practices after that. Marshall Fields, because they had evacuated some of their goods, they were able to open fairly quickly at a new location. Funny enough, at one time, Marshall Fields operated out of a barn, the Chicago City Railway Company barn at 20th and State. So they operated there for a little time until they were able to rebuild. Marshall Fields, the company, Field and Leiter, was, excuse me, they were able to meet obligations to their employees and creditors, which was incredibly rare. At this point, when a business ran out of money, they literally just said, sorry, we're not paying you. And Fields, because they operated on a cash basis, they encouraged everyone else to buy on credit, but they didn't. So because they didn't buy on credit, they had enough in reserves that they were able to pay everyone that they owed. So again, that made them very unique. After the Great Chicago Fire, they ended up splitting wholesale and retail. So the wholesale business ended up moving to a different location because business had grown so much that they definitely needed the space. So they made that choice. At this point, I do want to talk about Levi Leiter just briefly. Levi Leiter was a bit of a curmudgeon, and he did the back of office kind of work. He managed the money and the credit and things like that. But he was apparently, at least based on the version that Marshall Field, the man, shares, he was a bit of a jerk to some of the customers, kind of accosting them and telling them they didn't deserve as much credit as they had and demanding that they pay, things like that. So Marshall Field, the man, became frustrated with Levi Leiter and decided it was time to part ways. So he asked Levi Leiter how much he thought the business was so that they could dissolve the partnership. Levi Leiter knew that Marshall Fields did not have the money to buy Levi out. So Levi decided to lowball the price in order to buy out Marshall Field. And what he did not know is that Marshall Field had lined up some of the other executives in the store to be partners. So Levi Leiter lowballed the price, and then Marshall Field was able to pay it. And that was the end of Levi Leiter. The store was sold, or the partnership was dissolved, and Levi Leiter received what is today worth about $500 million. So obviously worth an enormous amount of money in that period. And the fact that Marshall Field, the man, and his partners could pay that amount says a lot. Levi Leiter ended up moving to Lake Geneva. He had 2 children. His daughter, Mary, was the first of the dollar princesses who went to England to marry aristocrats in exchange for their money. The reason why this happened is because people like Levi Leiter were considered new money and not worth the time of the established wealthy people in the United States. And in England in particular, the aristocracy needed infusions of cash to manage their estates. The death tax in England was incredibly high, and the maintenance of the properties that aristocrats would have had was also very expensive. So this worked in everyone's favor. So Mary Leiter ended up married to an English lord. And at one time, she was actually the second highest ranked woman in all of England, next to Queen Victoria. Her husband became the Viceroy of India. So that's how she got the number 2 ranking of any woman. Levi Leiter's son ended up investing in corn futures and other product futures, and ended up losing pretty much all of the money. And that was the end of that. So I want to share a picture of Field and Leiter, the store before and after the Great Chicago Fire. You can see, my goodness, what a difference. You can also see the Field and Leiter store was definitely much smaller than the one that ended up being built in its place. The original one is only 5 stories, and it's not the full block. But you can see the devastation was complete. Field and Leiter passed up the opportunity to buy more of the property on that block. And lo and behold, it was purchased by the Carson's company. And Marshall Field, the man, realized that this happened, and he thought, I can't let it go. So he ended up buying the property from the Carsons for a pretty high markup. I'm sure the Carson family was quite pleased with the way that transaction went. And that was one of the few times that Marshall Field, the man, had been vested in business. This is another iconic image immediately after the Great Chicago Fire. The sign there on the post says, "Cash boys and work girls will be paid what is due them Monday, 9 a.m., October 16th. it gives an address, and it's field and lighter. So they worked pretty hard to make sure that people knew how they could collect their wages that were due them. And again, this was extraordinary that Fields made the effort to make sure that they paid people. Just a couple of years later, there was yet another fire at Marshall Fields, November 14th of 1877. As the story goes, there was a work person who left a blowtorch on. They ended up actually not being able to save any more merchandise than they did in the Great Chicago Fire. And this time it's actually because of their popularity. Marshall Fields was such a valued store by 1877 that when the word came out that it was on fire, you had people from all over the city rushing to help, firefighters and police officers and bystanders. And it ended up being like, if you can imagine, not this year, but in another year, cooking Thanksgiving dinner with 50 people in your kitchen. That's really what ended up happening. There was such chaos that you had people throwing $5,000 lace, like the skeins of lace out windows and having it land in the mud. I'm sure there were people that managed to take products for themselves, and it just ended up being a bit of a mess. They were able to open fairly quickly at a location that was considered horrible. It is where the Art Institute now stands. That used to be an exhibition space, and it used to be a very unpopular space. The reason why is because Lake Michigan at one time was a place where people threw all their garbage, any kind of sewage. If your cow died, that's where you throw it, garbage, everything went into the lake. And it definitely did not smell very good, especially in the summer. So this was not a desirable location. So Marshall Fields had to really encourage people to go there to purchase. So they ended up hiring stagecoaches to travel from the corner of State and Randolph every 5 minutes to encourage people to go to this location. They were able to stock the store very quickly because they also had the wholesale business, and they were not in the same place. So the wholesale business was fully stocked and able to go. The 1893 World's Fair was obviously a pinnacle moment for Chicago, and certainly it was for Marshall Fields as well. Gordon Selfridge is quoted saying that his goal was to dramatize their great store before the world, to provide a special thrill in State Street for the thousands upon thousands of visitors expected for the fair. They must come, stare, and buy, then go to their homes speaking the wonders of Marshall Fields. And that is truly what ended up happening. So Marshall Fields made a significant splash across the world. Fields would have been a store that people knew of, even people from outside of Chicago. It was a well-known store, and you had people from Macy's and other Bloomingdale's, other well-known retail establishments used to come to Marshall Fields to see what Marshall Fields was doing, because they were the leader in a lot of these sales techniques and new innovations. So 1803, December 30th, the Iroquois Theater fire happened. This Iroquois Theater was billed as absolutely fireproof. If you know anything about the Titanic, that may ring a bell. This is a period in time where people felt like they had mastered Mother Nature. And so this theater is marketed as completely fireproof. The reason why they thought that is because they had an innovative curtain design, and most fires in theaters at that time would have started on stage. So this curtain was designed to prevent the fire from spreading. However, when they built the theater, they used a varnish on all of the wood that ended up being flammable. So obviously, things did not go well once the fire started. So in this matinee performance, the ushers decided to make sure that nobody snuck into the theater. So they locked all the doors. And in 20 minutes, 571 people ended up dying. Many of them piled up at the doors trying to get out, trapped inside. The death toll eventually was 602 people. It still remains the most deadly single building fire in US history. So to this day, it still holds that record. Immediately after the fire, where do people go when they want to find their loved ones, when they need supplies, anything like that. Fields is the place that people go. That is just the place where people gather. So as always, people poured into Fields. Fields supplied clothing, blankets. They dispatched their delivery trucks from the warehouse to make sure that people had what they needed in that year. And that was something that Fields did on a regular basis. When there was emergency, they would open their warehouse and just provide those goods to people in need. Here's an image after the fire. You can just see the amount of devastation. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906. Chicago was actually the first city to donate any supplies to San Francisco. They donated almost $1 million. And Marshall Field, the man, was very much involved in that. Marshall Field, and this is funny because it's in all of the research that I've done. Field and Company donated blankets, and all these sources very specifically mention women's underwear as a thing that was donated. I don't know why that's so significant, but okay. So I want to make sure I respect that by saying women's underwear. And they provided leadership and financial support to this initiative. The Eastland disaster in 1915, you may have heard of that. We recently recognized the 100-year anniversary of that event. So the Eastland was a boat that had been retrofitted multiple times and ended up becoming incredibly top heavy. On this particular day, July 24th, you had employees of Western Electric gathering to go on a picnic. So there were about 2,500 people on board when the ship, it didn't even leave port, it just tipped over. You can see in this picture that the boat is literally right there in port, right at the dock. So why did so many people pass away? Why did so many people die if the boat was right there? Well, a couple different reasons. First of all, many of them were trapped in the boat and couldn't get out. Also, people didn't necessarily know how to swim. People were wearing corsets, which didn't help. And the fabric of choice back then would have been wool. And wool becomes incredibly heavy when it gets wet. So you pair all those things together, and even though they were right there on shore, it made it very difficult. So Fields immediately offered blankets and linens to cover the bodies. They opened their wholesale business as well. They provided cotton duck and drapery poles to use as stretchers. And there weren't enough hearses to get all the people and the bodies to the funerals. And it was a very difficult event. You had full families that would have passed away, you know, mother, father, 8 kids, all dying in this tragedy. So it was pretty tough to get all those funerals done. But Fields donated 39 delivery trucks and drivers to make sure that the people and the mourners got to the funerals on time, because there were just so many all happening at once. This is an image from the 1934 World's Fair, and you can see your keys to Chicago. There's 2 of them. One is attending the fair, and the other is America's store, Marshall Field and Company. And that was how they presented themselves. Marshall Field, the man, was very much involved in philanthropy. He donated about $10 million and solicited about $2.5 million additional dollars to establish the Chicago Natural History Museum, which is now known as the Field Museum. He also donated about $361,000 to get the University of Chicago back up and running. That institution had been closed for about 30 years because they had debt problems, and Marshall Field was able to donate just $361,000 to get it going again. That cracks me up, because you think about how much it costs to attend there for 4 years, and the fact that he was able to get the entire institution up and running for that amount of money. Wow. In addition to that, he was involved in founding a lot of the institutions that we know today in Chicago: the Art Institute, the Museum of Science and Industry, the Chicago Symphony, the Historical Society. He was involved in combining the YMCA and the Chicago Library. He also donated quite a bit to individuals and church. So that's yet another place where he would have made contributions. He was relatively generous, but again, he did not like to be asked. He liked to be the one who offered the money. When he was asked, he tended to be a little more stingy. Some other facts about Marshall Field. This will make us all feel better about paying property taxes. So Marshall Field's paid over $500,000 in Cook County taxes per year. his real estate holdings in the city were extensive. He also paid about $250,000 in taxes in other states. It's important to remember that during his lifetime, there was no income tax. That amendment to the Constitution was not passed until 1913. So he would have paid more than most of the other robber barons in taxes simply because he owned so much real estate, and that was the main thing that was taxed. So by 1902, he owed about what we estimate to be, he owned $40 million in real estate, and he probably paid more in taxes than any other American in the country. His son, Marshall Field II, died of what is mysterious circumstances, as the story goes. He was apparently at the Everly sisters' house of ill repute. That was credited as the first place that someone drank champagne out of a woman's slipper. It was a place where you would have to pay thousands and thousands of dollars to attend, but you could get pretty much any service that you wanted. So the rumor is that he was shot at the Everly sisters' home and then secreted back to his own house in order to prevent any scandal. The official story from the Field family is that he shot himself with his gun while cleaning it, but the direction of the shot made it very unlikely that that happened. When he died, it dramatically impacted his father, and his father died just a few months later, leaving Marshall Field III as the heir to the fortune. Marshall Field III, though, if you're worried about him and his money, his grandfather put in his will that Marshall Field III could not get the principal of his money until he turned 50 to prevent him from spending anything inappropriately. As you probably know, each November there are protests in the city of Chicago. People are still upset about the fact that Marshall Fields is no longer the name of that business. Macy's changed the name because it was cheaper for them to market nationally than it was to Marshall Fields as a separate store name. We could debate whether that was a good business choice or not. This November may be a better time to protest than some other Novembers in Chicago. I think if I was going to pick a month to protest, it would probably be April or May, because in the city, that's always a much more comfortable time. So now I will take your questions. It looks like there's a few in the chat. And then we'll take whatever questions you might have in your voice. So let's go. I'm going to go right back up to the beginning. Please don't forget you have a COVID survey and an Illinois Humanities update. So Chicago fire was 1871. Oh, thank you. Okay, so Bill and Janie Snyden, yes, you are absolutely right. Frango is short for Frederick and Nelson's store on the West Coast, and then it was changed to Frango. In the 1940s, Fields did have a babysitting service, so mothers could leave their children while they went shopping. Wow. So again, think about all the different ways Marshall Fields made it easy for women to shop there all day long. You know, they're going to watch your children so you can shop. I mean, that's incredible. So thank you for sharing that. The merchandise mart, my dilemma with this presentation is I have cut it back about 7 times and it still continues to be too long. There's so much information. So the merchandise mart was a building that Marshall Fields had built. Unfortunately, it came online in 1931, which was probably the absolute worst year for a building that size to be available for commercial space. So they ended up selling it to Joseph P. Kennedy at an enormous loss. It was at that time the largest space in the country, the largest. So let's see. There is some debris from the Chicago fire also in Streeterville. There's a lot of debris. Let's see. So when did they begin having visits with Santa? Researching this has been a bit frustrating. It's really hard to pin down exactly when some things started. They just seem to have kind of morphed into being. I would think, knowing how the legend of Santa, the time frame in which that grew, that probably by the late 20s, early 30s, is probably about as early as Santa would have shown up. Santa was definitely a much bigger thing by the late 1940s, the post-World War II era. That's where we would have seen a lot more of that. The holiday windows, they actually had people who spent their entire career just creating those holiday windows. They were different every single year. They were incredibly elaborate in their design. And when Marshall Field's, the store, ended up selling off the name to Macy's, and since then they have actually taken some of that commercial space and converted it. You can buy, apparently they're about to sell some condos there. So you could live in what used to be Marshall Fields, but they sold a lot of those materials that they still had available. So you could have potentially bought part of those holiday windows for personal use. Can you imagine? That would have been amazing. Oh, wow. So Susan Schnecker is sharing that she was lost there when she was 4, and that they locked all the doors until she was found. And that's really important. Marshall Fields was, it was a place where they cared about you, and people perceived that. You know, shutting all the doors, locking them certainly cost them some money, but they were focused on making sure, again, that they had customers forever. A lot of the space on the 8th and 9th floors and above is, at this point, it is vacant, and they are working towards, like I said, converting some of that space to condos. With COVID, I'm not quite sure what the status is of that, but that is kind of what they're looking at doing at this point. And wow, I can imagine just how amazing that must have been to have a bridal luncheon at the Walnut Room with a bridal fashion show and registry information and all of that. And again, when you think about it from a business perspective, Marshall Fields, making sure that every bride felt like they were special, would encourage every bride to think that Marshall Fields was the place they had to go. So it just created a new generation of customers that would come and buy. And when you think about any demographic that is in the market to buy a lot of stuff, it's new brides, you know, especially in a time when Marshall Fields sold furniture and wedding and kitchen and all those kind of things, and baby materials. It was a perfect way to get new customers in the store and dedicated to them. So no, I do not know about the removal of the Marshall Fields name on the Frango mince box. I actually have one hidden. It's hidden upstairs. I like to keep one hidden away at all times. Don't let my kids know. But no, I didn't realize, I hadn't noticed that the name was taken off. So I have to assume that's because Macy's is trying to brand things as Macy's, but no, I didn't know that. The Marshall Fields logo shifted over time. Once Levi Leiter left the building, so to speak, that's when you started to see the Marshall Fields logo that we're familiar with start to evolve. I've tried to use a few different versions of the logo in the presentation just to illustrate some of the different ways that Marshall Fields represented themselves. The signature was the most consistent of all of it. I did refer to the CTA stop for Marshall Fields. It was on the 2nd floor. And again, it was part of the L line back when it ran through State Street. I don't know exactly when that disappeared, but I know that in the early 20th century that was there. I have an image in another presentation that actually shows the stop, and you can actually find it on, if you go to Google Images, you can pull that right up. So does anyone else have any questions? I think I got everybody.
You left us
Wow,
speechless.
so that's either very good or very bad. Wake up, everyone, wake up.
Well, this was terrific. You know, thank you so much for
Oh, you're welcome.
spending your time with us tonight.
It is nice to talk about something fun, isn't it?
Oh, and light. This November is a pretty heavy one this year.
Yes, it is. It is nice to think about a little nostalgia and some happy things. So I am glad to be able to share. I'll give you one last fun fact. In the 1960s, Marshall Fields used they used German Shepherds as security dogs at night. And they ended up having to discontinue that because anytime they had workmen in the store, they ended up with problems. So you can imagine that that did not go well. But Marshall Fields had been around for such a long time that they ended up trying a lot of really interesting things in their store.
Sometimes
So
innovation comes with a price.
it does, and sometimes innovation disappears. Sometimes you try and then you have to undo it. So
Exactly, exactly. Well, thank you again, and happy Thanksgiving to you and your family, as well as to everybody else here tonight.
well, thank you very much. Again, I appreciate your attention. And it was fun to be in your living rooms from my dining room.
All right. Thank you again, Sarah.
Thank you. All right. Have a
Alrighty.
wonderful evening.
Okay. Bye-bye.